40 years since it first arrived in China, the United Nations has witnessed remarkable changes. China has pulled some 800 million people out of poverty, more than 10% of the planet's entire population. And China transformed itself from a poor country into the world's second largest economy. Meanwhile, China has also evolved from a major recipient of international aid into an important donor. Indeed, while it continues to host over a dozen UN agencies, China is now the second largest contributor to the UN's regular budget. China also plays a key role in some of the UN's biggest challenges. So how can the China-UN partnership help maintain or even strengthen the UN's uniquely vital role in the 21st century? I'm pleased to be joined in the UN headquarters here in New York by the UN Under-Secretary General for Socio and Economic Affairs, Liu Zhenmin. Mr. Liu, thank you very much for joining us.
Nice to see you, Liu Xin, since Paris Conference on Climate Change at the end of 2015.
Absolutely. Since you mentioned this,
yeah.
2015 was the last time we talked. We met at the Paris Climate Change Conference. It was a historic time. So why don't we just start from that topic, climate change, which is very, very much on the top of list of priorities for the United Nations. Where are we at this moment in terms of implementing what was agreed in Paris?
You know, in Paris, almost all member states made their contribution that are called nationally determined contributions. But probably I think implementation is not very good. But more important the commitments, contributions are not ambitious enough.
What exactly are the obstacles that have stood in the way for more ambitious goals and stronger implementation? It was a very cheerful moment, right, 2015, when we reached the agreement in Paris. And
yes.
What are the obstacles standing in the way?
I think one of the issues that has been created by the announced withdrawal of the United States from Paris Agreement, and also the lack of ambition of other member states. This summit on September 23rd intended to mobilize international support and to raise ambition for further mitigation measures. So this is a moment for the international community to reach consensus that they really need to take action in the coming decade.
With the biggest developed country out of the climate change ambition, let's say, how much confidence do you have in mobilizing the rest of the world to be even more ambitious, and especially when the world growth is facing downward pressure, right? The global economic growth forecast is being downwarded constantly.
That's another reason that we are worried about, because you see, this is a moment for all member states to ensure the really energy transition from the traditional use of fossil fuels to the renewable, clean, and new energy. It means that there's a kind of vision that for humankind we need to achieve the goal of so-called carbon neutral by 2050. But that, recent downward of the world economic development really will impact that. Will have a negative impact on that.
How is China affecting the global efforts in fighting climate change?
China's role has been very critical as well as very positive. So in Paris, China really contributed a lot in reaching the Paris Agreement, and over the past 4 years, China really delivered very well. So I think China has set is one of the good examples for the world that the energy transition is possible. So economic transition also is possible. For the United Nations, I think we are quite confident that the countries like China and some Europeans, even some other emerging economies, I think they are doing very well. towards that end.
Let's talk some more about other priorities on the agenda of the United Nations. For instance, the reform that's been undergoing in the UN structure. Where is the progress so far? And going further, what will be the biggest challenge?
Actually, since Secretary General Antonio Guterres took office in January 2017, he initiated a number of reform streams. One of them is to improve the UN development system. The other one to improve the management system, and the third one is to improve the peace and security pillar. Actually, reform, objective reform, just not for reform itself. Reform, objective reform, is to facilitate the implementation of the 2030 agenda. So since the 2030 agenda for sustainable development was adopted by the world leaders in 2015, the entire world in a period of achieving 2030 agenda. But this is very challenging. For example, I think eradication poverty. Our recent assessment is that for a group of countries, particularly African countries, if they are in the next decade, their economic growth, they cannot maintain economic growth by double-digit growth. It means that they will not be able to achieve this goal.
What is the UN going to do specifically, for instance, eradicate poverty?
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you really can do that can make a difference?
I think actually through the UN development system reform, Secretary General's vision and objective is to mobilize the whole UN system to coordinate the UN support at the country level and at the regional level, especially at the country level. That's why the most tangible outcome for the UN development system reform is to have set up a so-called new and reinvigorated resident coordinator system. So this new and resident coordinator will be in a position at the country level to coordinate all the country teams of the UN system to jointly support the host government. For the UN system, I think we are going to try and help them to see how to align their national development plan with the 2030 agenda. But for the real development, we need support, substantive support, financial support, technical support from the entire international community.
Which kind of countries are in the best position to provide this kind of support?
I think actually people, in search for the media and the think tanks talk about China's role in Africa. Actually, really, over the past decade, China has built up its bilateral cooperation with African countries. But most internationally speaking, or globally speaking, China's contribution to Africa is not confined to bilateral cooperation, to bilateral projects, but also mobilized and attracted international investment in Africa. You will see Japan, India, some European countries, even US. I think they found new interest in cooperation and in supporting African countries. So that's why I think in the 2030 agenda, we need really a group of countries really to take the lead in supporting Africa.
What does it mean for China to take such lead in helping some least developed countries in Africa to achieve development?
I think China's support, China's cooperation with African countries and with other ILDC countries is not the issue of just for project cooperation and program cooperation. China's sharing of its own experiences, it will be very instrumental. For those developing countries and especially ILDC countries, I think they really do not know how they are going to be developed. So it's the issue of what the right path for these countries to achieve their development. People in the United Nations, I think people are always talking about Rwanda. Rwanda was emerged from a conflict, but now it seems one of the best countries in Africa in the economic development. I think one of the reasons is they learned a lot from the Chinese experiences. Yeah. So many good examples: Ethiopia, even Nigeria. I think for those countries, they are really learning from China in achieving their economic and social development.
From your position as Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, you are, of course, partly responsible for spreading good practices from different parts of the world to help the development in places where it's needed. But there are critics who say China's development way or model is not good, that China is going to these places for its own economic interests, sometimes at the expense of the interests of local people or local resources or the local environment. From the UN's perspective, are there concerns on these fronts?
No. I think actually, there be, of course, on China's cooperation and Japanese cooperation and the Indian cooperation, the European cooperation, there's a different assessment, different comments. That's quite natural. But I think actually it's always for the host country to find a way for their cooperation. That's why I think that what is the UN doing, United Nations doing, through improvement of our development system, we should be in a position to help the host government to find the right approach and cooperate with different partners. That's why I think, when President Xi initiated the One Belt, One Road initiative 6 years ago, actually there are some both the high respect and also critics, the differences, but gradually I think to be accepted. So that's why Secretary General Antonio Guterres has been rightly, I think, be advocated that the Belt and Road Initiative would contribute immensely to the achievement of the 2030 agenda. So that Belt and Road Initiative provided a very meaningful and substantive platform for international cooperation.
So let's talk about China. This year will mark 40 years of the United Nations presence in China. And it's a very special journey, I understand. So how do you describe the kind of journey that the UN has had in China in helping China find partners in achieving its development goals, exactly what you said the UN is trying to do?
In 1971, 26th session of the General Assembly adopted a historical resolution 2017-58, restored China's rights and representation in the United Nations and the whole UN system. So China's engagement with the United Nations since 1971. But the substantive collaboration started really with opening up of the reform of China initiated 40 years ago. Over the 40 years, I think really China gradually becoming indispensable substantive partner of the United Nations. 40 years ago, China remains a poor developing country. Of course, in the United Nations, China is an important country because it is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. So it's a big country. It's an important country. But economically, it's a poor developing country. So past 40 years is for China is not only for achieving its own economic and social development, but also its integration in the international system, in the international order. In integrating into the international system and in integrating itself in the economic globalization, actually China has strengthened fully its cooperation with the United Nations. So that's why I think China is now becoming a very important member of the United Nations. It's not only the permanent member of the Security Council, it's the largest troop contributing country for UN peacekeeping operations among the P5. This is for the peace and security side, but for the development side, China become an important partner for supporting the UN development pillar.
China, I understand, also is now the #1 contributor to the United Nations regular budget.
Number two.
Number two, sorry. #1 is the United States.
Yeah.
So I understand that's in line with China's overall economic size, being the second largest economy in the world. But some people would argue China's per capita GDP is still only in the middle range, let's say, of all the countries in the world, some $9,000 per year. So how does China put that into balance? Its overall size, because it's huge population, but per capita, you know, it's also still in a very mediocre level, let's say.
Yes, actually, you know, China's contribution to the United Nations budget has been increased year after year. I think that over the past decade, I've witnessed that increase. China last year, China now became the second largest contributor. It means about 12%. But the UN formula for allocating the share of the contributions is based on the share of the GDP in the total global economy. So China's share now is around 15%. China GDP, of global share of the GDP is 15%. Why between 15 and 12? China, because as a developing country, as a mid-income country, China still enjoys the kind of the benefit of a so-called low per capita income adjustment. Otherwise, it's just purely based on the share of the total GDP.
I see.
Its contribution should be 15%. That's why I think to be, but for China, I think to be for the United Nations, be most appreciative would be China. You also paid its contribution always timely. That's been really be ensured to be the United Nations could function, because you know for the UN we are now, it's not the issue of budget. We are also confronting the issue of the so-called cash flow crisis. This is one of the issues of the financial situation, and because of the delay of the payment of some member states of their shares of budget.
What about the peacekeeping side? China is the largest contributor to UN peacekeepers.
Among P5.
Among the P5?
Yes.
Okay. Is there any significance for China as the biggest contributor to peacekeeping forces among the P5?
Yeah. Peacekeeping, I think, really has become an important function of the United Nations in these conflict-torn countries. So after, you know, the ending of the conflict, to ensure that peace would prevail in the country concerned, Security Council normally decide to send a peacekeeping mission. We need troops. But until now, most of the peacekeeping troops are coming from developing countries.
I see.
You know, like you see, from Asian countries, South Asian countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and for Africa, it'd be Egypt, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and a number of others. So it's mainly developing countries. Very few developed countries send their troops for the peacekeeping. That's why China is among the P5. Although China's contribution is just the second, but for the troop contributing, it's first, #1. I think that's demonstrated China's involvement and substantive contribution to the peace process in those conflict countries. You know, actually, China, since its funding, promoting for the peaceful settlement of disputes, also supporting the prevention of disputes. But I think since the 1990s, China also engaged in peacekeeping operations. So this, I think, is a big shift of China's foreign policy. This is a demonstration for China's support and contribution to the peace process in those countries. Of course, also really helped those countries. I think China, from your point of view, I think China peacekeepers really have well received and highly appreciated.
Let me ask you this question. Looking back at the 40 years between China and the United Nations, what do you think is the biggest contribution that this relationship has made to the United Nations?
No, actually, the United Nations is now still remains the most important, most universal and authoritative international organization. United Nations really is the center of international cooperation, center for multilateralism, and the center for globalization. So supporting United Nations is supporting multilateralism, supporting globalization. So China is now, as a whole process over its engagement with the United Nations over the past 48 years, especially since the last 40 years of its reform. I think it will be China becoming a very critical member and partner of the United Nations. So China engagement is multifaceted. It will be covering all aspects of UN. Because for the United Nations, we need support of all the 193 members, but most critically, we need support of all the major powers. China is now among the major powers.
Looking forward, with the United States, at least for now, increasingly talking about America first, withdrawing from multilateral arrangements or agreements, how is China going to be expected to uphold the system of multilateralism, of globalization? Is China ready yet to be the pillar of this system?
Actually, I think for the United Nations and for Secretary General Antonio Guterres himself, we are talking quite often that multilateralism is irreversible. Globalization is irreversible. United Nations still remains the center for multilateralism. So we believe that I think the current policy of the U.S. government is just temporary. U.S.-UN relationship is not isolated issue. It's an issue that be incorporated, I think, interconnect with U.S. perception of their role in multilateralism and in globalization. I think gradually U.S. administration will realize that the United Nations is important for them.
This year will mark the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, and China is determined to continue to develop itself, to be rich and strong and contribute even more to the development of the world. So in the not-so-distant future, and I quote Secretary General Mr. Guterres, he said that, looking into the not-so-distant future, I see the possibility of the emergence of two competing blocs, each with their own dominant currency, trade and financial rules, their own internet and artificial intelligence strategy, and their own contradictory geopolitical and military views. Is that going to happen?
I don't think that will happen very soon. You know, I think to my understanding, I think China policy is continue to support United Nations, support the current international system. I think because with Chinese continuous increase and the growth of China, China's share in the international system will be different. But that will help to build up the international system. You know, people got used to see China's emerging and from the traditional perspective. But as one thing, they also ignored that the People's Republic of China, the new China, was born after the Second World War and after the founding of the United Nations. You know, if you look at China's engagement, China's overall development over the past 70 years, China, it took a few steps, a few periods for China to integrate. You know, in the first 22 years, from 1949 to 1971, until China was secured its restoration of its representation in the United Nations, China was isolated by the international community. It's outside New York, outside the UN, outside the international system. But you will see looking even that period, the objective of Chinese government to get into the United Nations. That has been a long objective for Chinese government.
22 years. For
22 years. If you look at last 48 years, of course, the first 80 years, China in a process of transition from isolation to full engagement. But over the past 40 years, China fully engaged, fully integrated. That's why I think I'm confident, because I witnessed this China growth, China integration in the international system. I'm fully confident, I think, even with continued growth of China, I think China, we don't expect there be two competing blocks. That's why I think for the United Nations, we need to avoid the major powers getting into the old traditional Cold War period. That's why we need to strongly support the international globalization. People in some countries might be critical on globalization. Fine, we could really improve globalization. Support kind of so-called fair, inclusive, and sustainable globalization. Actually, every country needs to learn some experiences and improve. That's also for China and for the United States, for developing countries and for developed countries. There's no issue of decoupling, but the issue of continued cooperation and collaboration.
Thank you so much. We're going to leave it there. Under Secretary General for the United Nations for Social and Economic Affairs, Liu Zhenmin.
Thank you, Liu Xin. Thank you for the interview.
And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point, with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from the UN headquarters here in New York. As usual, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.